Hello. This week and next week we're going to be going over mostly vocabulary, but the reason that I have put chapter 6 with going over vocabulary is because when you're trying to develop fluent readers and writers, you have to have the vocabulary to back it up. They have to be in a vocabulary-rich environment in order for true fluency to really start coming about. And just as a little bit of vocabulary work on your own, the very definition of fluency is the ability to read and write effortlessly and efficiently. And we're wanting your students to get to that point. Most children reach that stage during usually, I'm talking most children, usually around mid-second to third grade, kind of through that combination of explicit instruction and authentic reading and writing that we've been talking about from the very beginning with a balanced literacy approach. But if you really want to see an example of explicit instruction and authentic experiences, I think at its best, I am hoping that when you look at chapter 6, you're going to look very carefully at pages 182 to 185, because Ms. Williams has a bunch of second graders on those pages, and it is, to me, instruction at its best. If you start looking through it, it begins with talking about using reading and writing as tools of learning, or tools for learning. They're doing kind of a little bit of a book study, much like the literature units that you all are putting together right now. And theirs just happens to be over in an Eric Carle book called A House for Hermit Crab. And it goes through and it talks about how the teacher has read it several times and that the children are rereading it at listening centers. And they've got other related literature to it, much like I've asked you to have related literature to whatever book or topic that you are choosing for your literature units. And they're using Moving Day by Kaplan, Pagoo by Halling, and a lot of other books that kind of go along with the theme that they're working on. And it goes on to talk about that the teachers read some aloud, children have read others independently or with their reading buddies, and they're writing about what they're reading when it comes to the hermit crabs in their reading logs. We keep talking about that the writing is so important for them to be doing along with it. And they're also doing a lot of writing with their vocabulary words. And it talks about that they have created a word wall that has words coming from these books that they've been reading that has to do with like these coral or these hermit crabs, because they've got coral, crustacean, eggs, they've got pinchers, sea urchins, seaweed, molting, sea anemone, and so forth. The children refer to those words as they write about the hermit crabs. The word wall is a working wall there for them to use. And that is all kind of a part of their fluency. But their fluency did not start there. Their fluency started from another word wall. Their fluency started from their frequently appearing or high frequency words that they have been working on since the very beginning of the school year. As a matter of fact, high frequency words they've been working on ever since first grade, if they're second graders. And on page 188 of your textbook, it has a good list of the 300 high frequency words that kids should be really familiar with by third grade. As a matter of fact, it even goes into an explanation in your book of how many should be taught a week. it goes into an explanation in your book of how teaching them is not easy, but it gives you a lot of different little ideas for teaching them, because it talks about doing things like the see and hear the word, say the word, spell the word again, write the word, check the word, say the word again. That all comes actually from brain research, because if you do all of that with a word, but there's brain research out there that if you do all of that with a word and you use that word correctly 7 times, that word becomes your word. And that's kind of exactly what that all is coming from there. But do keep those pages in mind, because those will come back and really help you whenever you're trying to put together all of this vocabulary work. But it goes on with Ms. Williams working with her students. It talks about her using magnetic letters for her students to practice spelling the words with. It talks about the chant and clap method that she's using very effectively on page 183, where they are chanting the word, clapping, spelling the word, and then saying the word again. And it's not just the teacher doing that, but the students follow, and then she has another student that does it, and the other students follow that person. They take turns writing those sentences on a chart. As a matter of fact, the teacher is using those in interactive writing lessons on top of page 184, like we were talking about last week and week before last. They are doing a lot of work with the stories and the writing and the vocabulary usage in literacy centers that it talks about on 184. They even have a 6th grade student aide who comes in and helps kind of make sure that the kids are moving through the centers. She has made like these little center passports that as the kids move through the different learning centers, they have to get their little center passports stamped. They write a retelling, which is those higher order thinking skills, those HOTS, higher order thinking skills, with the students, where they're doing a retelling, or you might have them writing an alternate ending. But everything that this teacher is doing all the way through here is just good, solid learning. And it takes a combination of all that for things to really sink in on, like these 2nd graders, for example. So I hope that you'll spend some time taking a look at that, because it's just teaching at its best. When we're talking about word identification strategies, there is a lot in your book on word identification strategies. Beginning on page 189, it talks about things like using phoneme, grapheme correspondences, so that you're working on the sounds and the writing of the sounds. It goes into quite a bit of discussion on that. It talks about the phonic analysis, where you're breaking down the sounds into the different phonemes. It talks about decoding by analogy on 191. Really good chart on 191, by the way. Analysis of the syllables, taking apart the different words. But if you look here, I've kind of got it broken down for you, that we teach students to read and spell those high frequency words that we were talking about 3 different ways. Whenever you are having them take them apart using phonics rules, studying those vowel patterns like consonant, vowel consonant sections of words, and trying to understand it and trying to write it and everything, that's pure phonic analysis. When we're talking about analogies, decoding by analogy is using those word families, becoming very familiar with Elkonin boxes in order to take words apart and learn them. For example, they see the word fight and they know that the one that begins with an N must be night, and because they make the association. When they're breaking them into syllables, that's taking those phonemic, or not phonemic, but that's taking those phonics rules that they've already been studying, like the consonant vowel consonant patterns or consonant vowel patterns, and knowing where to divide them up into syllables and being able to take the syllables apart and pronounce them and then put them together. Then, of course, the morphemic analysis, they're applying what they know about affixes in root words to decode longer words, like antiseptic. If you look at this, for example, we know that anti means against, right? Well, the part of the word that is sept, you may have heard of the word sepsis, means infection. So anytime you come across anti meaning against and sep or sepsis meaning infection, you know that that is anti or against infection. Antiseptic means helping to guard against infection. So being able to teach that morphemic analysis to your students is really going to help them a lot with decoding. I have several handouts that I'm going to give you this week in our face-to-face classes that have to do with that, and a really good children's book to share with you where kids kind of become word detectives in the story and are learning how to take words apart and figure them out. I'll give you another for example. Like autobiography. When you're teaching kids about an autobiography, auto means self or same, of course. Bio means life or living, and graphy means to write. So it would be a writing of a story about someone's life done by themselves. Do you see that? Taking it apart and being able to figure out the different word parts like that really is good. That's one of the reasons that I'm having you use the etymology in your vocabulary words that you're putting together for your literature unit. There are 24 common words. Back looking at those high frequency words on 187, there are 24 common words that kindergartners learn. These are taught through that explicit instruction. They're words like the, and they don't necessarily follow all the phonics rules. They have to learn those by sight. They do those through a lot of practice with these different word identification strategies that we're talking about here, or that like Ms. Williams is doing in the story. Then you add gradually to them. There are 300 in all of those high frequency words. I'm really kind of hoping that you will make sure and take a look at those whenever you're going through your book. When we're talking about those root words, the affixes, the etymologies that I just got finished mentioning to you, there are two types of suffixes. There are inflectional and derivational. Inflectional changes the verb tenses of a word. It talks about that on page 193. Derivational are what I was mentioning earlier about the actual part of the word and where they derive from, the etymologies of the word. For example, the word astronaut. Astro literally means star, and naut means a sailor, so an astronaut is a sailor of the stars. Not only will kids enjoy learning about those word parts, but believe it or not, they'll really and truly be able to start decoding a lot of different words. There is a teacher checklist on page 193 that I'm hoping a lot of you will take a look at when it comes to all of these different breaking words apart. Keep that in mind. It also has to do with teaching kids those unfamiliar words. One of the things you've got to remember is this. And when you are taking the Oklahoma reading test, the ORT, in your diagnosis class, please do not forget this, because over and over again we have people go, I forget what a morpheme is. You shouldn't. You've probably had it in Foundations of Reading. You've had it in here now several times, and you're going to have it a lot in diagnosis. But the smallest meaningful part of a word is a morpheme. So it is actually those morphemes of a word that you are playing with whenever you're studying etymologies. Sometimes a morpheme is a whole word. It's a free morpheme, like cup or hope or cover, okay? Or even like astro. Sometimes a morpheme isn't a whole word. It's a bound morpheme. As for example, re, is a morpheme, but it can't work on its own. But if you put it in front of rewrite, we know that changes the meaning. If we have the word that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but if we put it in front of cover, we have uncover, and that changes the meaning, and so forth. There is a lot in your textbook about etymologies and how learning about these word parts, learning about what these morphemes mean, and the root words and the affixes and so forth, how they change words. There's a lot about that if you will look on page 232 when you're going through and reading your book this week. In your book, when we're talking about components of reading fluency, a big part of reading fluency or achieving reading fluency is working on that vocabulary. And when we're talking about reading fluency, they've got to know those high frequency words. If you go back and you look at the high frequency words that we've been talking about, for example, in kindergarten, they learn those 24 words that they just know automatically. They know them by sight. During first grade, they add another 100 words on. During second grade, they're up to 200 words added on. And then in third grade, they have the full 300 high frequency words. Those high frequency words appear again in a lot of different what we call word lists that teachers work with. You'll hear names of word lists like Dolch sight word list, the Stetson sight word list, the Fry sight word list, and so forth. All of those are lists that teachers of words that teachers work from, that are those high frequency words that your students really and truly do have to know. You work on that constantly, and teachers use running records, they use informal reading inventories, they use classroom text to document word knowledge and to document fluency. There are some tools listed on page 197 for helping you with all of that. Just know that, for example, if you are working on that with your students, you can be assured that you're working on reading fluency. There are a few different areas of reading fluency that I want you to be very aware of. I want you to be aware of the vocabulary of it. For example, automaticity is the accuracy of reading fluency, the ability to recognize words automatically. Everything that I've been talking to you about so far, everything between pages 186 to 193 with these high frequency words, that's what we've been talking about. Another component of reading fluency is the speed. Reading speed refers to the rate at which students read. I want you to notice this next line. To read fluently, students must read at least 100 words per minute. 100 words per minute. It talks about that on pages 193 to 194. Having the students do repeated readings, choral reading, the guided reading. I've got readers theater here, listening centers, partner reading, echo reading, poetry reading, so forth. That helps increase reading speed. Then there's the prosody. You've heard me talk about this ever since children's literature, if you had children's lit with me. It's the ability to orally read sentences expressively, appropriate phrasing, appropriate intonation, that volume, that smoothness, that pacing, being able to pause in the right places, your voice going up and down. It talks a lot about that in this chapter on pages 194 to 195. There's also a rubric I've included in here. If you will look on page 196, prosody is kind of hard to really put a score on, really assess, but there's a really good rubric on page 196 that if I were you, I would save, because you don't come across those kinds of rubrics very often. Notice I have on here reading fluency usually precedes writing fluency, but the two are clearly linked. How many times have you heard me talking about that? The more the students do, the more reading the students do, the sooner they'll reach writing fluency. The more writing the students do, the sooner they'll reach reading fluency. It all has to go hand in hand. When we're talking about reading stamina, when students have become fluent readers, your focus has to shift to helping them develop reading stamina. Students need the stamina to read for 30 minutes or more by the time they're in the second grade. To do this, you're going to have to give them opportunities to read independently for increasingly longer periods. The younger they are, the shorter the period of time, of course, but you've got to give them the time. You've got to give them books that help them read at that fluency level, read the words that they know, that they're familiar with, at that fluency level in order to reach the stamina. And whether you are a fan of Dr. Seuss or not, Dr. Seuss was like a wizard at this, because did you know that the Cat in the Hat, Green Eggs and Ham, One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish, there's at least one other that I know I'm leaving out, but that 75 to 90% of the words in those books, the concentration, 75 to 90% of the concentration of the words in those books come straight off of like the Dolch sight word list, the high frequency sight word list. He was a master at that. As a matter of fact, whenever he wrote, I believe it was The Cat in the Hat, maybe, might have been Green Eggs and Ham. But when he wrote the book, it was because someone had bet him that he couldn't do it, that he could not use all of those high frequency words and put it together in a good book for kids. And if you go through and you look, The Cat in the Hat has 225 of those high frequency words used over and over and over again in it. Would that help reach reading or build reading stamina? Absolutely. It was Green Eggs and Ham that he won the bet with, because if you go through and you look at Green Eggs and Ham, he only uses, I think, 50 words in that book, 50 different words in that book. They all come from the high frequency word list. And he uses those words in different combinations over and over and over again. it was a stroke of genius, and it has helped a lot of different kids develop their reading stamina. There's a lot of components of writing fluency that I want to include in here since we're talking about fluency, and it is about reading and writing effortlessly and efficiently. Pages 198 to 201 has a lot about the components of reading fluency, just like the components of writing fluency. Just like the components of reading fluency, we have the automaticity, the accuracy. Fluent writers write most words automatically. We have the writing speed, just like we had the reading speed. Students must write quickly to keep pace with their thinking. In the legibility, students have to be able to decipher what they have read. Kind of like whenever we're talking about prosody with reading. Think about it. Prosody in reading helps us put some type of knowledge to it. It helps us put some type of feeling to our reading where we can better understand what we're reading. Well, legibility does the same thing for writing. I don't know how many times I've had a kid bring something up to me to show me, and I said, okay, now read this right here for me, and they start reading and they can't even read their own writing. Well, that's one of the reasons that handwriting is making a comeback, or penmanship, I guess I should say, is making a comeback, because kids have to be able to read their own writing in order to decipher what it is, in order to be able to know what it says. And then, of course, there's the voice aspect of it. Voice gives an emotional feeling to a piece of writing. You have to read and reread a kid's or your kid's compositions to evaluate their unique style. After a while, even if your students don't even remember to put their name at the top of the paper, you're going to be able to pick out who they are simply by the voice that you hear through their writing. Like, this doesn't sound like Mary, but it does sound like John, and so forth. But again, remember what I said earlier about the two being linked? Page 198 to 201 in your book has a lot about this. It also, in your textbook, has a lot about working with disfluent students. There's a lot all the way from pages 202 to 206, even for older children. At the bottom of 206, make a note of this. At the bottom of 206 in your book, if I were you, where it says obstacles to fluency, I would keep that. I would take a picture of it. I would run it off. I would copy it somewhere, but I would hang on to that, because every single one of those are going to help you remember kind of how to help with fluency. Think if you're not even thinking of your own classroom, think of whenever you're in diagnosis. On page 207, that's where it has a whole list of things to do to help with the automaticity. On page 207, it also has word identification help. On pages 208 to 210, it has a lot in there to help with like slow reading or slow writing speeds. So it's really good information that I'm really hoping that you will go in there and you will make note of and come back and use again. There are 4 principles of fluency instruction that we've talked about, but I want to do it one more time. The 4 principles are these. You model fluent reading for your students. When we have talked about those interactive reading lessons, that is helping students with their fluency. When we've talked about those interactive writing lessons, those are helping your students with their writing fluency. When teachers provide support while students are reading and writing, and you are there and you're walking around and you're conferencing with them and so forth, that is helping their fluency. Whenever I have on here, teachers have students do repeated readings of brief text. Of course, you have students doing repeated readings of brief text, but you also have them doing repeated writings along with you while you're doing those interactive writing lessons. Teachers focus students' attentions on chunking words into meaningful phrases, on working on prosody. Teachers model that prosody in order for students to pick up on it even quicker. And I have put on here, please look at pages 206 to 212 about how effective teachers eliminate all of those obstacles to fluency, whether it is about reading or, of course, starting in on 210 to 212 when it has to do with helping with fluency in writing. I mentioned stamina earlier. Again, the reading stamina refers to the ability to read silently for increasingly longer periods. It's the same way with writing. They develop reading stamina by reading books at their independent level. It's the same way with writing. Teachers use periods of SSR or sustained silent reading to help students develop reading stamina, increasingly longer periods. Upper elementary children should be able to rapidly form letters and spell words. If they are not doing that, a lot more interactive writing lessons and penmanship and so forth is needed. Students become fluent writers because they practice fluent writing. You have to have it in order for your students to get better at what they're doing. They have to practice. But whenever we're talking about practicing reading, yes, reading out loud is a good form of helping students become better at reading, more fluent at reading. But round-robin reading should not be used. I'm going to say that one more time. Round-robin reading, you know the kind they've been doing since the 1800s. Really, we know that it should not be used now. And don't let them tell you, oh, it's okay because we do popcorn reading. Well, that's BS, because very often, unless they're truly doing popcorn reading, there's two things that happen. With popcorn reading, the teacher's still going to be calling on students and forcing them to read even if they don't want to. Or when the students are calling on each other, they're only going to be calling on either their friends or the kids that they want to be uncomfortable, or the kids they want to put on the spot, depending upon which kid's doing it. So it really encourages inefficient reading habits. It takes away from the love of reading. Miss Snell and I have both said that if we ever come into a classroom where a student teacher is teaching and they're doing round-robin reading, we're going to fail you. So I just want you to keep that in mind. Round-robin reading should never be a common practice in a classroom. Whenever you are choosing words to study to expand vocabulary, we're going to be talking about this a lot in our face-to-face classes this week. I'm kind of excited about that because I'm going to be bringing in some really good children's books that will kind of help you. But students' vocabularies actually grow about 3,000 to 4,000 words a year, 7 to 10 every day. A lot depends on you, and I've put in here, no stress. But think about that. Their vocabularies grow about 3,000 to 4,000 words a year. Pages 216 to 219 in your textbook has a real neat story in there again. And this time, this teacher has put together a Word Wizards Club. And there are really neat activities that the students are doing in their Word Wizards Club. There are some neat little jobs that they have been given in order to there's some really neat jobs that they've been given in order to expand their vocabulary. There are the ones who are doing the research. There's the ones who are picking out the words. There are the ones who are going over the words with the little groups. It's kind of a neat thing to look at. And we're going to be talking about that some more whenever I'm sharing the books with you. But academic vocabulary, for example, is discussed at length on page 220. I hope that you will look at that. It is that academic vocabulary that you will be using on your word walls. There are 3 different tiers of words that you work on with students. And I'm going to have a handout for you all in class, and we're going to be talking about those. But we basically refer to them as Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 words. With Tier 1 words, that is their basic vocabulary. That is the most basic words that kids are familiar with whenever they actually even come to you in school. They just need to learn how to read them. Tier 2 are high frequency words. They're really important for reading comprehension. They're the ones that come up specifically in stories, like in the words that were specific to, like the Hermit Crab book earlier that we were talking about, that children need to work on. And then there's also the Tier 3 words, which is considered the little bit higher minded. The Tier 3 words are the content specific vocabulary, the words that they won't see a whole lot except in a math book. Think quotient, divisor, addend, subtract, different things like that. Cause and effect a lot in social studies, the word experiment in science, so forth and so on. Those are the Tier 3 words that we're going to be discussing. But all of those words, even the specialized ones, need to be used on word walls. I really have trouble stressing that enough, but there are those different levels of word knowledge. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of different levels of attaining word knowledge. For example, we say level 1 is when students don't recognize the word at all, but you're going to teach it to them. Level 2 is when they see the word, they can pronounce it. They might not know what it means, but they know they know they can sound it out. Level 3 is partial word knowledge. Students know one meaning of the word and can use it in a sentence, but if it is taken out of context and used in a different sentence, they may not be able to come up with the same thing. Then full word knowledge. They can use it, they can write it, they use it often. It's obvious that they have used it 7 times or more, like I mentioned earlier. To determine the meaning of an unfamiliar word, your students should be taught how to find the meaning of an unfamiliar word. You have to teach them to use context clues. You have to teach them to analyze those word parts, like astronaut that I was mentioning earlier. Teach them how to check a dictionary, old-fashioned checking a dictionary, or even looking one up online. There's a lot about that between pages 241 to 243. there are things that you could do. You could even create an anchor chart or a poster that has things that students could do when they encounter an unfamiliar word. And you could make it cute. It could be, you know, when you encounter a strange word. And the little word could be sitting down here looking like a little animal or something. Number 1, reread the sentence containing the word. Number 2, use context clues. Number 3, look for familiar root words and affixes. Number 4, try to pronounce that word. And number 5, finally, use a dictionary. Vocabulary does not always just come on its own. And a lot of teachers think it does, but it doesn't. You have to provide vocabulary instruction. This is kind of where I was talking about those different levels of word knowledge. Look at pages 222 to 223 on that. 223 in your book talks at great length about word consciousness. I am hoping that everybody will pay attention to what the word or the term word consciousness means. It actually has to do with students being aware of vocabulary being used in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different contexts. You have to provide a really rich vocabulary environment for your students. I went and observed a student teacher last week that had it down pat. I mean, she was providing all of these different levels of instruction with vocabulary with her students and constantly talking about them. But then throwing them out there, using them, using the same word the kids were studying in a different way and going, oh, I don't think it's used right. What does that mean there? And the kids would try to figure it out in order to help her. You're going to be immersing your students in this rich vocabulary environment. Lots of listening, lots of talking, lots of reading, lots of writing, lots of conversation back and forth. Not when you're talking at your students, but actually having good conversational dialogue, I guess you could say, a good dialogue back and forth about, or not about, but using those beautiful big vocabulary words. You're going to be teaching words through active involvement. You're going to be teaching them through fun activities. You're going to be teaching those words through games in the classroom. Teach them those word learning strategies that we've already been talking about so students can figure out the meanings of those unfamiliar words, whether it be learning the etymologies of the words or whether it be being able to divide them into syllables and so forth. I'm going to be sharing with you some books from a series of books called Weighty Word Books in the face-to-face this week, and I think you'll really like those, but you should look those books up. Monitor your students' vocabulary growth. You're going to be observing them. You're going to be conferencing with them to assess their vocabulary using different rubrics like some of the ones that can be found in this chapter. And then, of course, even the vocabulary tests. Remember, word walls are very important to have in your classroom. Words should be added as they come up in the text that the students are reading. Not in advance, but as they come up. Make them use them in their writing. Make them use them in their speaking back and forth with you. Students should be able to use those word walls during those grand conversations we've talked about. Word study activities that you have them doing in their writing projects. The word wall should be a living part of your classroom. There's no reason why, once you feel like your students have mastered sets of words, that they should continue to stay up. Take them down, make room for more. But in those earlier grades, those high frequency words probably need to stay up most of the time. There are a lot of different word study activities. I mentioned word study activities. There are a lot of different ones mentioned in this chapter. Page 238 talks about word posters, word maps, word diagrams. I'm going to be giving you a word map in your face-to-face classes this week. Using them in possible sentences that you think might come up in what is about to be read. Word sorts, where you're actually sorting words into 2 or more different categories in order to narrow down meaning. Dramatizing words, where kids get to actually act them out. I'm going to be sharing the book Miscellaneous with you guys, where that's exactly what the students get to do in her class. Putting together word chains, where you're chaining words with their synonyms in order to understand meanings. Semantic feature analysis, it goes over that on pages 240 to 241 at great length, where you are taking all of the different parts of the word to figure out meaning. One of the things that I want you to remember, please, 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 is that there is such a thing as the Matthew effect. When you are working with your students, if you are putting out a lot of effort to have that vocabulary rich environment, and you are giving them every opportunity to become more fluent, your students as a whole will get richer. But here's the thing, if you're not helping them, only the more capable ones are going to end up with the larger vocabularies. Only the more capable ones are going to read books with a more sophisticated vocabulary. If you are not right there trying to help them out and constantly trying to provide all those learning opportunities, all of that balanced approach to literacy, focusing very heavily on all of these things that we do to make kids more fluent and to help kids have a bigger vocabulary. If you don't, the gulf between the capable and the less capable readers are just going to keep, it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The Matthew effect means simply that the rich get richer. So it is your job as a teacher to be constantly present and to be planning meaningful activities and meaningful instruction in your class to help all of your students' vocabularies and fluency be richer, and not just the ones that are more capable. If they do more writing, they're better writers. If they do more reading, they are more capable and better readers. It's going to be up to you how much experience you bring to the table for them, how much experiences that you create in your classroom for them. It should be constant. If it's constant and you are keeping those kids engaged, not only are they going to become fluent readers and writers, but I guarantee you it cuts down on your classroom behavior problems. It's a huge classroom management technique as well. I hope you enjoy these 2 chapters. They're 2 of my favorites. And there's a lot of good articles for you all to read loaded into Blackboard as well.